Welcome to Moving with Life. This is episode number 20. I am Andy Acosta. My friend Eddie Signs is joining me today. Listeners, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for lending us your ears. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to leave reviews and comments. We are on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and YouTube. So episode number 20, we dive into a book titled When the River Dreams, The Life of Marine Sgt. Freddy Gonzalez, written by John W. Flores. The reason to diving into this book is because this past weekend was Memorial Day weekend, and that was the end goal for this podcast, was to bring this story out and shed some light on one soldier who didn't come home after a war. In this particular case, the Vietnam War. So many facts, so much great detail in this story, and me and Eddie really enjoyed it. It was enlightening. It was informative, and again, the point was to remember, all those who served and didn't come home, and why Memorial Day exists in the first place. So, without further ado, here is Moving with Life. So, it's Memorial Day weekend.
Yes, it is.
And it didn't click for me, at least, until today. Because you had said, I hope everybody's having a great Memorial Day weekend. And even I failed to think about why do we have a Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah.
That's basically how my day's gone. Of course, my family came over, we had barbecue and stuff. We're still celebrating my cousin's first communion, so that was still priority as far as, what we had planned for the day. And, but again, it's man, Memorial Day weekend. Especially because I don't know if you've seen anybody, but I know I've seen people, of course, posting they're at the beach or they're out of town. They're on some type of little mini vacation, as people call it nowadays.
That happens a lot, I feel like, especially this holiday weekend.
Mm-hmm. So, with that, I was like, and that's because I had prepared the podcast for this week, but again, nowhere was there, I guess you could say, content to at least mention, about Memorial Day weekend. I leading up to now, I felt it necessary to, hey, we should mention it, at least. So then, of course, naturally, Jocko posts a Memorial Day little excerpt today. It's 14 minutes, and it's basically a letter. And I didn't even finish listening to it because I immediately got to then processing, literally, skimmed through the entire book in an hour and a half, from when most of my family left to right now when you got here. And I'll get into this in a bit. But anyways, let me finish Jocko. As far as he read a letter, because he talks about, of course, when you go to war, these guys write their letter, and it's basically their, if they die, that's their final word, right? And so he read this one, and of course he taught. It's a true story. It's a real letter of a soldier that died. And I don't want to even get which war. I think it's one of the Iraq or Afghanistan. I think it was the more modern wars that has happened. But of course, first he starts off with, I owe everybody gratitude. This is the soldier talking, from the letter. I owe everybody gratitude, to my wife, my universe, everything like that. And then he had I believe it was one little boy who, I don't even know how old, but he was young. Anyways. And of course, he says, you're going to grow up to be a big, strong man. You're going to be with your mom. And then a newborn that he never got to meet. And so as soon as he got to the newborn, I was like, okay, this podcast is going to be about Memorial Day. That's it. I if it turns into a conversation, cool. If it doesn't, okay. So that's where I started with. And I was like, okay, so what book do I want to use? All of last year, I read, several military books. And most of it's leadership esque, where it's written by Colonel David Hackworth. He served in Vietnam. He I mean, he doesn't directly say, "Oh, these are good leadership, bad leadership." He just gives his story. And initially, Jocko also picks apart this book. So then I read it to get the full detail. And there's things here and there. You see the concept of a good leader. You see the concept of a bad leader. You see teams giving up on their leaders because they're just not doing the best job they can do. Right. So there's all that mix. So there's him. Major Dick Winters from World War II has another book. It's called Beyond Band of Brothers, who he just passed away recently. World War II veteran. And he, like I said, that book I also read last year. Is super good. So anyways, so I was trying to debate, and I was like, I had this one book. It's called When the River Dreams, The Life of Marine Sgt. Freddy Gonzalez by John W. Flores. I got given this book years ago when it came out. Let me see when it came out. I'm going to open that real quick. This book got released 2006. John released it 2006. And got it signed. It's pretty cool. Got, to Andy Acosta from John, Semper Fi. And then Dolia Gonzalez, who is Marine Sergeant Freddy Gonzalez's mom. And, well, I guess I might as well just say it. But Dolia, she's my aunt. And she's family relative. Well, not even family relative. She's my aunt. She's my grandma's sister. And I rarely ever mention it. I guess now it's going to be on the podcast. But I just feel like that context needs to be there because, like, well, how did you find this book? Well, because I got the book given to me, from the author that, wrote this story. So, as I was going through it, I was amazed because of, let's just assume that these facts are 95% accurate. This is a point of view, and even Jocko talks about it where, authors who write books, especially like somewhat biography about somebody else. There's gray areas, obviously. That's with everything. That also goes to, that can also be generally seen as like point of view. Everybody has a different point of view, so everybody has a different perspective, and writes differently. So, anyways, so as I was going through this book, and there's a lot of fact. I definitely recommend the read, and we're gonna go through it right now. But when like I said, I was first thinking about, okay, what book am I going to use? Am I going to go World War II? Am I going to do Vietnam? Am I going to do the Benghazi, which happened in 2012? Those 6 guys who served in Benghazi for the CIA base. There's that. What else do I have? World War II, Vietnam, the Benghazi attacks. I have another World War II book by E.B. Sledge, who served in World War II. It's called With the Old Breed. So, anyways, there's several books. And finally, I remembered I had this one, which is, like I said, When the River Dreams. And I said, well, let me start it. Let me see what content. Because at first I thought it was very like a third person like deal. And this guy John, he actually worked for the Monitor for a number of years. So he's very well known with the Valley. I don't know if he's born here or not. I was trying to. I didn't look up on the internet because I honestly I didn't have the time. But I was trying to skim the book to see if I could get any content from him, but all I found was that he wrote for the Monitor, and at some point he talked with my aunt and then my other aunt, which is Dolia's sister, because they used to work at the Echo Hotel downtown Edinburg, and he mentions that he would go to lunch there every day, and eventually he talked to like the head chef. At the time, this was like back, I think in the 90s. He said it took him like 10 years to to compile this book. So finally, my aunt says, yes, I'll talk to you. Because I do remember this. I remember being at her house and like some people from the Monitor coming by, and she didn't want to talk, and I only knew, I was like, what, 6 years old, like 6, 7 years old. We're young, you don't think about the things we think about now, even as 25-year-old millennials, whatever. So when I would see him, and then she would, and I'd see her turn him down, and I guess this guy, he just, stayed persistent, and he definitely, I would say do it right, because there's also, if you're nagging, you're more likely not gonna get it right. Anyhow, I'm gonna jump into this book, and we're gonna see where it takes us. This was his first letter to my aunt. July 9, 1965. Hi, Mom. How are you? Well, I am fine. I received your letters today, and from Margaret, Leo, Ella, grandmother, Maria Elena. Well, this first week at Camp Pendleton Rifle Range was a little hard and easy. Well, I saw the Pacific Ocean. I can see it from the base. We sure get up early, but I am used to it. So Shorty is back at his base? Well, I have 2 weeks here. Hope I make it with the rifle. I fired the M14 rifle Tuesday and today. It's not very hard. Here at Camp Pendleton Rifle Range, we have large barracks. I also received a letter from Delia. If you see more of my friends, tell them to write me. Today I received 6 letters. Glad to hear that the car is working. Hope it does not break down again. Mom, would send you money, but I need it here for laundry and all the things I use. I don't need money, so don't worry about that. I got paid last. I received $65, but had to pay back $45 for all the things I got when I got here. Dawn is very quiet, but it's cold at night. What is Milo doing in California? He won't any that isn't in Texas. Well, how's the valley? I sure miss dear old Edinburg. So Coach Barry is going to be a coach. Keep it coming. I miss you a lot. But it's only a short time before I get home. I am counting days like all the guys here. Love, from your son, who loves you with all his heart. Private Alfredo Gonzalez. P.S. I am going to church regularly. I have not missed a Sunday. I have gone to confession too. I know we will win because the Lord is on our side. Bye, Mom. Say hi to everyone. Grandmother, if she is home. Aurora, Krista, Maria Elena. I received her letters. Little Joe, Blanky, Uncle Tedrio, Aunt Mary. Bye, Alfredo Gonzalez. California is big and pretty, but I feel like Texas is bigger. I wouldn't trade it for the world. All right, so here's chapter 1. He was, for anybody who doesn't know, especially now, we've been getting a lot more views on YouTube, which is really awesome. I hope everybody's been enjoying it so far. But we do live in this town. I won't even call it small town anymore. I mean, there's 77,000 people. It's not that small. You know, there's a elementary down Sugar Road called Freddy Gonzalez Elementary. There's a street that was coined after Freddie after his service in Vietnam, Freddy Gonzalez Street. And there's even a VFW post that's also commemorated for him. So there's several things out here in Edinburg. So if you were to come by South, deep South Texas, specifically Edinburg, if you see Freddy Gonzalez, Alfredo Gonzalez, that's the reference, and this is the book that I'm getting some facts from. So here's the book, chapter 1. The nearby Rio Grande was flowing and full after heavy rains on typical sweltering South Texas night. May 23rd, 1946, when Alfredo Gonzalez Cantu was born in a small 3-story brown brick building named City County Hospital in the city of Edinburg. The tiny baby was smiling soon, after crying a little, and he was picked up and whisked away by a nurse. The doctor scribbled on a chart as he checked the mother carefully. A few weeks earlier, the doctor, Joe May, had advised the 16-year-old mother, Dolia Gonzalez, that she might die if she gave birth because she was not well and the fetus did not seem to be doing well either. "How is my baby?" Dolia said, crying a little herself, and holding a white, monogrammed handkerchief the doctor had given to her. "Tell me he's going to be okay." The tall, thin, pale-faced doctor, with thick black hair and black-framed glasses, continued his examination on her without speaking. Even with the serious situation, his face was friendly, a nice, broad smile with white teeth, a strong jaw and chin, and kind eyes. He wore a dark suit and tie and a white shirt, and a white doctor's smock. And he moved slowly, deliberately, checking her blood pressure with the old style portable device stationed on the table next to her bed. He slowly inflated the upper arm cuff with the stethoscope pressed against the artery of her arm below the cuff, listening for the pulse while watching the systolic and diastolic pressures. So that was interesting to me because I knew my aunt was young. I didn't know it was that young. I mean, 16, and I don't know. I don't want to say it's common now because if it happened then it must have just been as common. You know, just that the media is different now. You know, the way the word gets out is different. So that was interesting to me. So moving forward here, even though she was getting stronger, when Dolia left the hospital with her son, she did so by necessity. She could have easily stayed a few more days to fully recover. I had to work. I had to earn money. I was working as a waitress at the cafe downtown and I couldn't lose that job. And years later, I worked at the doctor's office and cleaned it and we lived nearby, she said. Though her mother and father, brothers and sisters lived nearby and they all worked, she still felt she had to pull her weight, especially with her new baby. In those days, families pulled together, you know. They worked and put their money together and took care of each other's kids too. So you knew who your babysitter was because it was probably your brother or sister or mother, Dole said with a laugh. She assumed both roles, mother and father. We didn't have much, but we had a good life. My dad was a trucker. He used to haul people back and forth, and we used to go to work in the cotton patch, and Freddie did too. My son was a good worker in the fields. Cabbage, carrots, cotton, you name it, he did it. And you know, we walked everywhere we went in the early days. So that's just again just giving a little introduction to the lifestyle, you know, and for my aunt for Dolia, you know, she as opposed to saying, "Oh man, you know, poor me" or whatever, it's like, "No, I got to work."
She went right after it. Just for frame of reference, so she was 16 when she had Freddie. That makes, and he was born in 46. The letter you read was that he'd written from Camp Pendleton was written in 65. Mm-hmm. Makes him about 19 years old when he was, I guess, in the Marines.
Yeah, that's when he signed up, yeah. It was the dawning of a brand new age, the single-parent household. But for women like Dolia, that did not mean anything resembling liberation. More like the change of responsibility. She never looked at raising Freddie as a burden. Instead, it was her greatest privilege, a joy. Her love and sacrifice for him over the years would help Freddie become a man of character and courage. I just wanted to make sure to point that paragraph out because it's different hearing some parents now. So as growing, it kind of already briefly mentioned, but you know, growing up, Freddie and my aunt and them, you know, they worked in the fields. That was one of the ways to be able to make a living. It wasn't just, not even just. It's not like today. You know, today there's technological advances where you can work on the internet, you work on a computer, you work in an office, and while there's always been office jobs, you know, particularly maybe like banks and stuff like that, you know, at the time, Edinburg was a small town. You know, there wasn't chain retail. You know, it was local retail, it was local restaurants, locally owned. You know, especially I know there's like names. You know, McAllen was a person, Farr was a person, Champion was a person, Sprague was a person. You know, all these streets that are named here in Edinburgh, like they're all people that helped build what is now Edinburgh. You know, and it's just interesting to me, but that's what it was. Then it was a small town. You know. That's just the way it was back then. And even then, where she mentions that they walked, you know, they walked. That was their way of transportation. Oh, here we go. So, it was summertime, the middle of August 1960, and Freddie had already made the transition from water boy for the work crews in the fields to regular field laborer. But soon he proved himself to be much more than that. Skipping forward a little bit. Today, most jobs are done by machine, though some are still manual labor and the pay is still low. Working and living conditions often remain substandard. And that, I just want to tie that into what I just said. As far as the way of life then. There, the university was probably like half a block compared to what it is now. There was space, there was fields, there was trees. It was a town. Like reiterating, it was a town. It wasn't a city yet. Freddie liked to remember when he was just a little kid, 8 or 9 years old, and Julia took him and cousin Shorty to the movies in town to see The Sands of Iwo Jima with John Wayne. The movie is about a tough Marine sergeant, John Stryker, played by Wayne, who trained and led young men in World War II in the Pacific Theater. Freddie remembered the feeling when he first saw that film. It was a surge of pride that rolled in his young soul like an ocean. The movie showed real battle scenes, battlefield film segments of the taking of the little desolate Pacific island of Iwo Jima from the entrenched and fanatically deadly Japanese army. Later, there was a timeless scene of the raising of American flag on the island's highest point, Mount Suribachi, immortalizing those young men who raised the flag. Several thousand Marines were killed in the bloody taking of the island, a critical possession that was to become a stopover for U.S. airplanes operating in the Pacific, as forces gradually edged closer to the Japanese mainland. I just wanted to read that part because that was his first little just feed.
There was that bug that bit him to, maybe inspire him to maybe one day serve. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
It's very cool. I mean, just for frame of reference, like it makes me think about the first time I got like bit with that music bug, and maybe for anyone listening, maybe now you're thinking about what you're passionate about and the first time that you felt that spark could just ignite with you, or within you rather.
Yep.
About whatever it is you're passionate about.
Mm-hmm. And you read you took the words right out of my mouth, because that's exactly what I thought. I'm like 8 or 9 years old. I'm like, okay, what was I doing 8 or 9 years old? I was like just barely diving into music. Like I hadn't even started like learning drums yet, or guitar yet. I know I was starting drums, and by this time I was already well into piano. So like I was there, but the bug didn't hit me till 10. But here they are 8 or 9 years old, and it's like, oh, there's a chance something like that happens. So he worked in the field. Eventually, did I mention here? He eventually worked enough to where he was able to get the first car. And my aunt mentions that he bought his first car. She was happy because now he could drive himself to school. He could drive her to work. He could pick her up from work. They didn't have to walk. And that was a big accomplishment. That was the thing. So now we're skipping basically towards his senior year. Finally, it was time for graduation. Dolia came home early that day, and Freddie was watching TV, spread out on the couch. Dolia was extra excited for several reasons. This was the day she had always hoped for, since that long ago morning that she'd taken Freddie to the first grade. Freddie watched the TV but was not paying attention to it. His mind was somewhere else. Suddenly it hit him again, and it started sinking in that he was really going to graduate, the first in his mother's family to do that. "This is really it, Mom," he said. She smiled and went to her bedroom to rest. Freddie took a shower and got dressed, all spiffed up. There were long hours leading up to that final moment when he would walk across that stage for both himself and his family. He was nervous because he knew how much it meant to Dolia. It was something she desperately wanted for herself, but she had to drop out and raise her boy. He was always acutely aware of her sacrifices for him. And that's why, even though he was not the scholarly type at all, played football and worked on the weekends, he was determined to get that last year done. Plus, he knew the high school diploma would help him in the Marines and later on in his life. He'd been telling Dolia that after his first 4 years was over, he wanted to come back to Edinburg and get a degree at the local college, and then coach football at EHS, Edinburg High School. Some of his old buddies still remember that Freddie desperately wanted to return to EHS and be a football coach. Also, years later in the interviews for this book, friends remembered Freddie's good sense of humor during his high school days. Less than a month after graduation, Freddie rode a bus from Edinburg to San Antonio with several other guys from his town, and once he arrived at the bus station in downtown San Antonio, near the Alamo and the river, he caught a taxi with a few of the boys, and they went to the Marine Corps recruiting office in the downtown area. a few blocks away. It was a 2-day process that involved physicals and paperwork, so they have to get a hotel. Freddie had saved a good deal of money that past summer, even as he helped Dolia with the bills and was able to buy the used car and he was affording himself a good time in San Antonio. He hadn't been able to travel to big cities much except with the football team. The next day, June 3rd, 1965, a group of young men all raised their right hands and were sworn in to the Marine Corps. Freddie signed up for the reserves for a 1 month period, and then he would go back and be sworn into the active duty Marines with the standard 4 year enlistment. He would report to boot camp in San Diego July 6, 1965. So there, he's now 18, 19, and he's now going to be a Marine officially. On the same night that he came back San Antonio, Freddie went out with some of his friends and they parked at the pool hall, another popular joint for kids. There they met JJ Avila, Robert Bellah, and a few girls from school. "So Fred, you finally did it. You really did it," Robert said, walking to the car. Freddie got out and shook his hand. "Yeah, it feels kind of strange knowing I will be gone for a long time," he said. JJ Avila hit Freddie on the shoulder. "Yeah, but you're up for it. Feel those muscles. You're tight, man. You're in shape," Freddie said. "The plane ride over there might be the toughest part. I've never been on a plane." They all laughed. So JJ Avila, I know at least I've known him for a long time. I never knew that he was basically a family friend. He has now had, I mean, JJ Avila Senior, technically, because he has JJ Avila Junior, that's our age. He's about 24, 25, or 25, 26, I think. I know he's playing basketball. I don't know if he's still playing basketball, but I know he had played for Navy. He then transferred to, I think, Colorado State, and he was playing for them. So he's still, I mean, he was doing that. Actually, I remember. He's actually now playing for the Bulls D-League team. That's what he's doing now. I believe he graduated, or whether he graduated college or not, but I know he's playing for a D-League team and he still wants to play. He's always been an athlete. I think he's like 6'5", 6'6". Like
wow.
He's a big boy. And he grew, and I remember being in 6th grade playing Pee Wee. He was already 6'3", like he was already over 6 foot, because he was just monstrous.
And you mentioned Robert Bellah in there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Man,
The late Robert Bellah.
The late Robert Bellah, who is the uncle, the late great uncle of a friend of ours that we graduated high school with. Man, it's I know, like, back then it must have been a really, really small town, and now it doesn't feel so small sometimes, you know. But man, just still shocking just how small it feels. Even maybe at what is Edinburg, 77,000 people?
Yeah.
About
77,100.
Man, still feels like such a small community. You mentioned those names, and yeah, know those names.
Yeah.
I know their grandkids. I know their nephews. I know their nieces. We went to school with all of them.
And now there's a high school named after Coach
Yeah.
Bellah. Yeah, man. I'm going to pause just for a second, because what we feel in this room, and hopefully we convey it on the audio, but it's very real. You know, this is, it's I'm seeing that it's one thing to read a somewhat of a biography from someone from World War II, or any war for that matter. But reading home, this is home. This is part of the town history. You know, speaking of going to the South Texas History Museum and all these things that are here downtown,
and they have Freddy Gonzalez's uniform at the museum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have the privilege of having one of the honor flags that they sent to my aunt. It's here in my room, and I have it here. She gave it to me. There's other memorabilia that we have, but for now it's at her. I mean, she has a lot of awesome stuff at her house, but she did give me this one a few years ago. I think around when this book came out. I can't read that date, but I think it's like
2008.
2008. So that's when she gave me that one, and I was on my way out of high school. Quick side note: that was around the time that the Marines pulled me out of class. I'll never forget the recruiter pulling me out of class to try to get me, and he's like, "Yeah, if you go to college, you can start off as a sergeant, or corporal, maybe something higher than a private. Basically private, you're the beginning stages, you're quote unquote a grunt, and then you go private first class, then I believe it's corporal, and then sergeant. Sergeant would be the next one. Then you move up the ladder. Honestly, I don't want to get anything else confused. But speaking of 2008, I do remember a Marine recruiter pulling me out of class, and I went to like the office and like, oh yeah, I speak to him, and I see this guy in the Marine, the dress uniform, not like camos. They're trying to present.
The dress blues.
Yes, dress blues. Very serious. And like, oh man, and I thought about it. I didn't think about honestly, I didn't think about it too hard because it wasn't enough to convince me because I knew I was gonna go to college. I still had 4 years ahead of me. Like I didn't know what was gonna happen, and at that age, for me at least, the war was already going on. September 11th had already happened. So maybe had I been at that age, in 2001, it would have been different. It would have been totally different. Of course, that's almost 10 years ago, and look where we're still at now, technically.
Yeah.
So, anyways, to not digress more, but interesting side note that I just remembered right now as we're talking about 2008, 2009, getting ready to graduate from high school. So back to the book. The weeks passed by quickly, and by July 5, 1965, Freddie was getting ready for the bus ride to the airport at San Antonio, where he would catch a flight to San Diego. He sat on the bed in his room after taking a shower and looked around at the posters on his wall. He looked through the window at the neighborhood, lifting the curtain. This town had been his home all his life. For a second, he felt like changing his mind. He didn't want to leave his mother and friends. Dolia knew that. But it was only for a second. His mind was firmly set on the Marine Corps and graduating from boot camp. Finally, he was packed and into the living room. "Mom, I'm ready," he said. She emerged from the bathroom. She hugged him again, with tears in her eyes. She took Freddie to the bus station, and the bus was already there. She looked in Freddie's gentle brown eyes the same way she did when he was a little boy, and the memories started. "Now write to me, Freddie. I'm going to miss you so much. I will be praying for you," she said. She handed him a little prayer book, and it had some money in it. So then, now he's off to boot camp. So obviously, I guess it might not be obvious if you don't, maybe haven't seen it, but I feel like the movies convey decently of what boot camp is. I mean, you'll never know unless you go, but the yelling, the screaming, even it's mentioned here in the book, about that. He gets off, he then flies to San Diego, gets off, drill instructor's there, and the yelling begins. So back to the book. Freddie was already in good shape physically from football training over the years and working hard most of his life. It was one less thing to worry about, but the real hard part was the mental aspect of boot camp. The DIs, drill instructors, were always playing mind games to see how smart and resilient and resourceful and mentally tough the guys were, especially at the beginning. It was like wolf puppies fighting to see who would be the pack leader later on. When combined with physical fatigue and lack of sleep, with a DI screaming at you at 2 a.m. at a surprise inspection, screaming at you to quickly take apart and reassemble your M14 rifle, the mind could get overwhelmed. But that prepared the recruits for the combat, at least theoretically. It at least separated the cooler-headed recruits from the emotionally challenged, leaders from followers, squared away from the screwed up. So this book, or at least this little piece that I'm about to read, it just seems like he picked up fast, regardless of any type of obstacle. He picked up things fast and he was able to move. From the first week or two, Freddie's leadership qualities were noted by his DIs. It was because even though he was struggling along with the rigid, relentless demands, he would take time to help out other guys to get squared away. Guys who were scared shitless, depressed, confused, not making the grade. And he had his own bad moments, but they didn't last long, and he managed to work around them. Where other guys would make fun of the screw-ups, Freddie might smile or laugh if something was funny, but he never humiliated anybody in a mean way. Instead, he would try to help if he could. Later, Marine officers said that was a great characteristic of Freddie's leadership skills. Tough but compassionate, never bullying anybody or making fun of them. Freddie was in Platoon 348 of the 3rd Recruit Training Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel P.H. Simpson. The drill instructor, also called the platoon commander, assigned to 348 was Sergeant K.H. Stoltz. His buddy Larry Gonzalez would graduate as the platoon honor man and Series Honorman as Private First Class or PFC. Larry Gonzalez, it just mentions here that Larry Gonzalez was a friend from California who was his rackmate. He I guess basically bunked with him. I guess they had dual bunks, and Larry was the one who bunked with him during the boot camp process. So here it gives a glimpse of what's going on. Obviously, 1965, there's the war going on in Vietnam. It's strong. I feel like because of the way the media maybe was at the time, besides the information being gray, the amount of content that compared to what we get now, it was really small compared to what we get now. So back to the book. At that time, in summer of '65, American military intervention in the Vietnam War between North and South was beginning to heat up at a rapid rate, and President Johnson was making plans that would require as many Marines and soldiers as could be trained and shipped out. This was largely happening without the American public realizing it. The instructors and recruits had no time to ponder geopolitics, the right or wrong of Vietnam. They just had the job to do. All Freddie could think about, besides his daily duties, was making it to the end and becoming a Marine. And training was very hard, as he had expected. He wrote to Dolia, and his letters reflected that. He also wrote to his friends and family, and held on to his letters until they became too big of a pile to fit into his footlocker, and the DI told him to get rid of them. So he would send just a pile of letters every time he could. His letters home reflected, in his quiet moments, a loneliness that was never out in the open. He'd always hide it behind a smile, and in an intense gaze while concentrating on difficult tasks. He did want to go home. Like everybody else, he was homesick at times, but more than that, he wanted to graduate. Finally, after 11 weeks of the worst hell the DIs could devise, he did just that. As one of the toughest warriors in the world, a defender of American ideals, he was an instrument of diplomacy. He saw it as peace through strength, a Marine Corps motto. So then the DIs, and I think this goes basically for any branch where you go through the initial boot camp, whether it's Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, they give you options. And I know in the Navy they call them billets. So like, let's say you want to work on a ship. Okay, you get a billet from there, and then you go do that. Navy SEALs, Special Ops, you do that. So that's what happens. So that's what happens. That's what's happening here, and he wanted to become a rifleman. Here in the book, it says after graduation, DI gave them all their assignments. Freddie had done well, so he could have just about anything he wanted, but his goal was to be a 0311, a rifleman in Vietnam, and that was exactly what he got. After boot camp was over, he had another 4 weeks of combat training at nearby Camp Pendleton. He graduated from that on October 25, 1965, and was then able to go home for some much anticipated leave time. So finally, he gets to go back home. He'd already been homesick, as I mentioned. He was just ready. And my closest connection was just us being in Nashville for 3 weeks. And I had distinctly told you, and I know someone asked us when we were out in Dallas, saying like, how do you guys feel about being out for 3 weeks? And at that time I was ready to be home. I'm like, let's assume we were on a tour. Cool, let's continue the tour. I'm down to continue the tour. But because we knew that we were coming back home, I was like, yeah, I'm ready to be home then. I'm ready to just sit down for a while.
We were anticipating it, and so yeah, when we spent those 3 weeks in Nashville, and then we came back to Texas, and then we had a show in Austin, and then in Frisco, and then in Dallas the following days, respectively. Yeah, it was just one of those, like, yeah, let's do these shows, knock them out, get them done, and get back on the road and get home. We even left the last one, so we played Dallas last, and then the next day we were able to go back home. We're probably out to 1 in the morning.
Just about.
And we left at 5 in the morning to get on the road.
And everybody's like, "You're leaving that?" Like, yeah, we're ready. That's it. This is
ready
it.
to go.
This is the last 8-hour stretch to get home. We're gonna be home.
We're ready to get there. Yeah.
Basically a month out. All right, so he knew he was going to Vietnam, and the way it seems here, you obviously have to travel. So they left, went to Hawaii, then from Hawaii to Japan, specifically Okinawa. That was in December 1965. And then from there, it says here in the book, he stayed in Okinawa for several weeks to get further training. And when time came to leave for Vietnam, it was by a Navy cargo plane that had a stopover at an airbase in the Philippines near Manila. That was the first real glimpse Freddie had of what Vietnam would be like. The colors were incredibly vibrant, the most beautiful green he'd ever seen. From the thick forest below, and the water from nearby Subic Bay was a dark blue, like the sky. He would travel to the Philippines later on R&R, rest and relaxation time. So there, he's finally, and for me, it's hard saying he's finally excited. I never got to meet him, obviously. I mean, if anybody does have a precursor, or as far as like maybe some prior knowledge to, and I'm gonna get to it, but um, still saying out loud, and as I was reading it, I'm like, how would I say this part? It's like he's like, man, it feels like I get to know him a bit, you know, considering obviously the time gap and even the delay from reading this book, you know, I had I not thought or think the way I think maybe leading up to this morning, you know, I wouldn't have read this book. You know, the podcast would have been something totally different. Anyways, back to the book. He was a rifleman in Company L, 3rd Battalion and 4th Marine Division. It was on that first 13-month tour of duty that he met another South Texas boy, Sabino Garcia of San Antonio, Texas. Sabino was a lance corporal in Freddie's unit and was able to show him the real facts of life in the jungle, far beyond the 4 weeks of combat training. I always told him to keep his rifle well oiled and to take good care of it because he would definitely be using it a lot, Sabino said. I liked Freddie a lot. He was a serious guy and he would look right at you with a serious look. But Freddie was just a private, learning the ropes with other new grunt Marines, looking for the enemy during that first tour. He learned fast, and combat was obviously his element, Sabino said. This next piece I'm gonna read just because, to me, it's very detrimental, and I think you'll get it, Eddie, and I'm pretty sure the listeners will get it too. But when I initially read this little paragraph, I was like, man, like, I was able to make so many ties with it. It just made sense to me. Let me read it first. Vietnam is a small nation south of China. The word Vietnamese means non-Chinese people of the South. 100 years before the birth of Christ, Vietnam became a part of the Chinese Empire, and for the next 1,000 years, Vietnam struggled for its independence, and that was finally achieved in 938 A.D. The American war planners at the White House and the Pentagon were not properly schooled or sensitized to the importance of such details of Vietnam history. Not knowing how tough, determined, and intelligent the enemy was, as demonstrated through their 1,000 years of fighting the Chinese, would become a major problem for the Americans during the 12-year Vietnam War. Primary note is the word Vietnamese means non-Chinese people of the South.
Yeah, that's very new information to me, very fresh. In that, man, like, it's kind of like, I don't want to say racist, but I mean, what else are you going to say? I don't know. It's something along those lines.
Demeaning.
It's demeaning, yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. That puts a whole new perspective on that country and their people for me.
Mm-hmm. And I tied it back into home in the sense of GT kids versus quote-unquote non-GT kids. It's like the kids know, you know? And in our case with technology, because the way things are now, kids are giving up. For them, they fought for 1,000 years. 1,000 years, dude? Like, no one lives that long, but yet it was strong enough to where they fought 1,000 years to get what they wanted.
And against the Chinese as well. Like, arguably one of the, you know, I mean, obviously a superpower and a superpower in today's modern world, but kind of has always been, if not a forerunner of being a superpower, like they've kind of just always been there. You know, they've been there.
Yes. They've always been present in any type of conflict that's gone on in the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, I just wanted to mention that because it was just like, man, that's so derogatory. You know, I felt bad. You know, like,
yeah.
We talk about not feeling bad for others, like in the sense of like, you know, they obviously didn't feel bad. They got angered, like, no, we are a people, we are a community, we are a civilization that deserve our independence. You know, they took it the whole complete dichotomy to feeling bad and used it, you know, for them to help them gain, you know, what they wanted, their land. Oh man, it it helps me not feel bad for them, but yet fight harder. Just fight harder. Do that.
Yeah.
All right, back to the book. Freddie learned his job well, and he became an expert at locating and avoiding booby traps, a critical skill in the field. Freddy Gonzalez could smell danger, so he was magic, one of Freddy's commanding officers would later say of him, as related through another sergeant. He and Sabino became good friends, and after Sabino rotated home when his tour ended a few months after Freddy arrived, Freddy would write to him. First, he wrote him at home, then Sabino was sent to Camp Lejeune to train young Marines. They did not know it then, but in February 1967, they'd both be at Lejeune together as instructors. So this is one of the letters that Freddie wrote to Sabino, and I thought it was pretty hilarious. So, how are you today or night? Me, I am still in paradise, the hospital with malaria. Freddie wrote to Sabino at his home on July 12, 1966. How many days do you have left? How's your mother? I bet she is very happy. And you wanted to stay at this miserable place for 6 more months, like the fool of Charlie. Quick side note, Charlie is the enemy in the case of Vietnam. How's Bear? Freddie called Sabino's mean girlfriend Bear, treating you. How does your stomach look? Are you fat now? Me, I have lost 20 pounds since I got sick. Well, Sabino, have to close now. Just a buddy who remembered you, Gonzalez. P.S. How about a Lone Star? Set him up, bartender. Another author's note. Freddie drew a can of Lone Star beer at the bottom of the letter.
Okay, so for everybody listening, I'm currently drinking Lone Star beer as we're doing this, and this was not planned at all. I'm just happened to walk in a Walker's, or Andy here's place with this Lone Star beer. He did not know I was bringing it. Man, that's great. That little passage just put a big old smile on my face. Let me tell you why. I feel like everybody's known, or I guess I think every generation since Freddie has known of Freddy Gonzalez, right? Because he's such a prominent memory staple pretty much in this town. Right. Andy, you were saying like they commemorated a street name after him in an elementary school and a park and so many things. And so we're very aware of his story. And for anyone listening that's not, I feel like the story is still developing if you don't know the complete story. But and I'm assuming you're going to get there. Mm-hmm. But he's just such a staple in this town. And I feel like growing up, we know about it and we're told about it and we're told that he was a hero, but we don't get told, or at least I didn't get told anything much else beyond that, just that he's an American hero. He's a hero to the town, And it's obvious with the street and the school and the park and et cetera, but that letter just revealed so much about his character, and like the way he teases his friend and calls his friend's girlfriend Bear, and like so many things, and it puts a big smile on my face because there's such a human element to it, mm-hmm. and it just like it sets up this character that I've known about Freddy Gonzalez ever since I could remember, like anything, growing up here in Edinburg. But it's just like it's like if I was watching a white and black movie and all of a sudden just a little splash of color came on. It was very cool.
Yeah. When I read this, I literally laughed out loud because I was like, "How's Bear?" And then I read the little parentheses part, Sabino's girlfriend, specifically Sabino's mean girlfriend.
Yeah.
I was like, man, that, and the cool part, because it just, for me, it just ties back to what Jocko talked about, some of the stories, because he sometimes makes it a point to mention some humorous parts in the stories. There's a dark part, but then these guys that were out in war, and this is, obviously it's universal, where, you had to have that moment of just laugh, you need to.
Yeah.
It's just, it's needed. It's not that whether you want it or not, sometimes it's just needed, for all intents and purposes.
I think that's something that gets lost in translation very easily. It's not anyone's fault, I don't think. But, we have this holiday set up, Memorial Day, and I feel like people get a lot of flack for, we're going to use the 3-day weekend and go to the beach or go do this, go out of town or do whatever, right? And then, I feel like it always surfaces up around this time of year with Memorial Day. It's like, oh, don't forget, it's not a holiday where you just get to, cook hot dogs or barbecue or whatever and then go to the beach. Like, this is, a holiday to remember, those who sacrificed the greatest thing of all, and then for our liberties and for our freedoms in this country. And so I feel like that's been pounding in really hard lately, but at least like the last few years that I've been paying attention. But, like no one ever really knows these people, these people that we call heroes, but we don't really know them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no, there's not a lot of resources for us to, look at the vast number of soldiers and servicemen who have sacrificed their lives for the greater good of this country and for the greater good of our liberties. And, there's just not a lot of resource to, other than maybe, you might have a family member here and there that serves, or maybe your great-grandfather served and passed and during a wartime, or maybe like some kind of small family tie connection like that.
Right.
But other than that, I mean, there's really no vivid picture of who these people are for us to look at. And I feel like it's, again, no one's fault, but it just gets lost in that translation. And just, man, thank God we have books like this that are written and just express very vividly a portrait of someone's character and how they were,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just gonna go back to the book.
Go for it.
We'll continue. I believe this is the last letter that Freddie wrote to Sabino. And here's back to the book. Finally, on January 1, 1967, he wrote, "How's everything going down there? Everything is just fine here. Not too much action. I made corporal about 2 weeks ago. I also got my orders. I'm waiting for a flight date. I'm going to Camp Lejeune. I might be in the 6th or 8th Marines. I hope it's the 8th Marines. Trevino got hit with a mine. He got it right in the groin. He is back in the States now. He is alright. I hate going to Lejeune. Some of the new guys here knew Gutierrez and you. One of them is named Holguin. How did your operation come out? See you later at Lejeune. Your friend, Fred." And so, let me pause again. So, Holguin is... I'm not going to mention the first name, but that's the last name of one of Brian's frat brothers who's in the reserves. Alright, let me continue. Freddie usually had only 2 requests in his letters home to Dolia, and they were simple. Send KoolAid and cookies. By the time the packages arrived, he opened them to find the cookies were smashed or crumbled, but it was good anyway. And the KoolAid was coveted like gold, and it was always good. He liked the pre-sweetened kind, and he would put it in his canteen and drink 2 or 3 quarts of it a day in the hot jungles of Vietnam, carefully placing the empty wrappers in his pocket so as not to leave any traces of trash behind for the enemy to find. Whatever Dolia could send him from home was always greatly anticipated, because the military food used on patrols, sea rations, normally tasted bland, especially compared to the MREs, meals ready to eat, used by the modern military. But it wasn't that bad if you were hungry. Canned breads, meat patties, ham and beans, and scrambled eggs. You'd have to put a few drops of water on the bread and heat it up on the sterno can to revive it from long incarceration. The good stuff was called peaches and pound cake. I just wanted to read that because of the KoolAid and cookies. I know for a time when I was in college, I did have a couple of pen pals, and eventually it kind of died out, and I would now say at my fault, because I did send out care packages for a good while, and I do still donate to the foundation, but I haven't sent out a care package. It's actually, they're based out of San Antonio. It's called Soldiers Angels. They're based out of San Antonio, and I donate every month. But yeah, like the KoolAid and cookies. All those carbs though. All right, back to the book. Finally, in January 1967, he was on his way back home after a brief stopover with a buddy in Arizona. He arrived in Edinburg on 30 days leave, and one of the first things he thought to himself, as he later told his friends, was, "I have seen some things I don't ever want to see again. I will never go back to Vietnam. I've had enough." When Freddie arrived in Edinburg after the end of his first tour, he was wearing the rank of corporal. He was already a seasoned veteran of combat, and there he was again, at a place that once seemed as distant as the moon, his dear old Edinburg. He stepped off the bus to smell the clean, cold, humid air of the valley, and he breathed it in deeply. He hoisted the green sea bag on his shoulder and started walking home, carrying a prized possession in his pocket that he never let go of in Vietnam, a key to the house. It was a good luck charm for him. Later, Dolia would say that it was the same Freddie there was something a little bit different about him that she couldn't describe. Of course, the gruesome nature of his experience naturally would have an effect on him, but it was more than that. Freddie had that 1,000-yard stare that a lot of veterans had, a sort of detachment from being in the bush of a long time. And he had been slightly dinged a few times, which meant he had been wounded, in his case, by bullet fragments or shrapnel. And he'd had malaria and spent some time in the hospital. After boot camp was over, Freddie found he'd gained about 20 pounds, but after the jungle time and the malaria, the sweat and the heat and stress, he'd lost about 30. He was thinner when Dolia saw him in January 1967 than when he'd left. So main thing there is like coming home that we hear about it now, and I think that's one of those things that I'll say thanks to the media, allowing veterans to get that word out, and so that people can be aware. Because I think that's part of the biggest thing. And going back to your statement, Eddie, as far as if you have members in the military versus those who don't at all, like not even like in my case where it's very distant, right, as far as timeline wise, but being that detached, having an opinion on a matter, and but I'm not saying the matter isn't worthy of fighting for, or your opinion's not worthy of fighting for, but if you can consider being detached from the situation, then I think you would be maybe less harsh. You would be, I don't even want to say willing to compromise, but you'd be more understanding. Period, which might change your direction, anyways. Compared to, or not even compared to anything. Compared to then going full on like anti-war or something, and yet you have no one in the military or you haven't even asked. Communication, general. Like let's just go to the bottom line of communication and talking and asking questions. I'm gonna go back to the book. Over the next 30 days at home, the only time Freddie even looked at his uniform was when he took it off that first night before going to bed. When he hung it in his closet, he shoved it to the side, out of sight, and pushed his regular clothes against it so he couldn't see it. He wanted nothing to remind him of the war. He'd seen so many things: death, chaos, corruption of the South Vietnamese soldiers, severe fear, innocent civilians getting caught in the crossfire between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese. And like most everybody else, except maybe for the inner city gang members who'd been drafted prior to the Vietnam War, the worst Freddie had seen was playing football, boxing a little, and having schoolyard type fights. But he'd never seen real death face to face, breathing down on him like a tornado of fire. The whirling winds of battle that kept turbulence brewing in his brain for weeks and months later. And a lot of other Marines like him had the same problem. So having that darkness that only few people will ever experience.
Is it too soon to get into something that stuck with me that Jordan Peterson said about PTSD?
Go ahead. No.
On the Joe Rogan episode, he was talking a lot about the nature of man, and then he kind of dived into why soldiers have PTSD when they come home, and it's because they've realized the violent nature that they're capable of and that their fellow men are capable of, and it creates that dissonance. And I don't know, like it is one of those things that seems obvious to you when it's like, when he says it, but it doesn't at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like one of those things. It's like I feel like I knew the underlying source of that in the back of my mind, but I've never fully connected that thought.
Right.
At least for me personally. Maybe you have. But I don't know. It's just something I had to mention with that passage being read.
Because it goes back to we talk about primal, that those instincts that that maybe you're not conscious about it, but when you hear, especially someone like Jordan Peterson, that we do have a trust in his, in his information and his work research. So when he says something like that it goes back to all these variables, it's like, dang, it's such a simple answer, but yeah, it's so hard to convey because you don't see it unless you go to war.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, not too soon, not too soon. You're good. So here's some light. Still, with it all, he felt euphoric about being back home. But during the course of his time there, he found out his girlfriend had changed her mind about getting engaged, and they decided not to pursue the relationship. It broke his heart, his friend said. Well, I guess it was half and half, because he was euphoric about being home, but yet, and this was, I guess I've never asked my aunt like these questions, but I've also know what it means to her. I mean, this is her son, her only son. So maybe that's why I've never been driven to ask questions, and hopefully, given this book, gives everybody, not just me, some insight on, thought processes of a single parent with a child going to war. He didn't talk about much of the war. He did not talk much about the war, Dolia said. Just what it was like out there on patrol, living conditions, the terrible heat, the humid air, the mosquitoes, and there was snakes, monkeys, and tigers. And he would have nightmares while at home, and he would scream out in the middle of the night. That scared me, and I worried about him. He was going through hell. But still, he worried about his buddies over there that he had left behind in Vietnam. He called me one day, and he said he was never going back. But then later he got a letter from some buddy back in Vietnam also, who told him that some guys was with him had gotten blown away in an ambush, and he felt he could have kept them alive, said JJ Avila. Then he started to change his mind, and when he said he was planning to go back to Vietnam, we all told him that he'd done his duty. He should definitely not go back. Freddie was always, to me, an overachiever. If he would not have been a hero in the military, I believe he would have been a hero here at home. Being the only child with no father, he could have gotten a deferment to stay out of Vietnam. Way down deep, we all knew that he wanted to get some money to give to his mom so she could have a better life, Avila said. Here we are, 38 years later, and she is still living in the same kind of life, still having to work because her son is not here. After Freddie got the letter from his buddy about the ambush, he walked outside and went for a long walk. He did not speak, but he told Dolia later that he could see the faces of his friends who had been wiped out. He could smell the gunpowder that clouded the stagnant jungle air after a firefight. He could hear the shrill screams of men in terrible pain. Men who would not make it back to base alive. Young faces that would never see whiskers or wrinkles, or a wife or children. They were like a garden of beautiful flowers cut down before fully blooming by a madman with a machete. So he's not necessarily contemplating with my aunt, but he's trying to kind of ease her into it. So here we go. Dolia tried to plead with Freddie, telling him, "Those guys were your friends, I know, but they're gone. You can't bring them back. Maybe you can help other guys to avoid the same thing, but you've done your duty. Listen to your friends. You don't have to go back." But Freddie first had to spend some time at Camp Lejeune, where he knew he'd volunteer for another tour. He didn't tell Dolia it was definite until he was at Lejeune. So yeah, I mean it was just foreseen, and I didn't know about the letter. I knew. I mean, my aunt's always said like he chose to go back, which ultimately it's his decision. But this letter, that's interesting. I think I'd do the same thing. I mean, I think you'd be so emotionally attached that you'd make that decision to go back. I think.
When you're in it that much, yeah, I think so too. I think that's what I would do. Not that I would ever, I think, enlist because I just can never seem to put on a pound of muscle. So
You will. You would. You would. There's actually some interesting. I'll have to get them to you, Eddie. There's some good stories of guests that have been on Jocko podcast. Specifically, one guy. I think he's like 5'7". He's about my height. Now he's a stern, 185, 200 pounds. I'm like, okay, cool. It made me feel good about like, okay, if the need rises, then I don't feel so bad. Even Jocko, I mean, Jocko's not that tall, but he started at like, let's say 175, 180, and now he's at 220. I mean, he put it on, bro.
Yeah, if anyone did, he did. That's for sure.
Because he even mentions like when he was on the ship in the early years, in the quote unquote dry years of his military service, that he was already on like the low to no carb like eating style. So he said like the ship would like serve chicken nuggets, and he'd get like a mountain of chicken nuggets, and just he would force feed himself because he needed like he wanted the fuel so that he could then go to work out and do whatever he needed to do. So there's always that.
Man, I've got more to comment about all this, but I feel like we should get to the last of your bullet points for this reading here first.
Are you sure?
Yeah, let's get back to it.
Okay. Back to the book. This was July 1967, and after spending several miserable months at Lejeune, he was finally headed where he felt destiny wanted him to be, in the real shit. He was made for it. He'd been promoted to sergeant earlier in July at Camp Pendleton for his excellent record and abilities, and with Company A of the 1st Marine Battalion, 1st Marines, 1st Division, in a base camp about 40 miles south of Da Nang. It was there he met Manuel Valdez, another Mexican-American from Texas. The two became buddies. Valdez is now a judge in Tarrant County, Texas, and he has held the post for 25 years. I was in Vietnam from the latter part of September 1966 to October 1967, and we were in the same division, but I was a radio operator and later a forward observer. I met Freddie at the beer hooch where a lot of the guys would go. Us Mexicanos would kind of gather together, Valdez said. Guys would come and go, and we'd drink and laugh, and then you never saw them again. You never knew what happened to them. Didn't even know their names a lot of times. Nobody ever went into anything planning to be a hero, but people were doing heroic acts all the time when nobody was looking, so nobody ever knew about it. A lot of times you just have to get killed to be a hero. How about that? For example, if a guy jumped on a grenade to save his buddies, but it didn't explode, then it doesn't mean anything. But the guy was still just as heroic. He didn't know it was a dud. Those things happen frequently. But I am proud of what Freddie did. I have absorbed all of this, and I appreciate it. This guy, we laughed and talked together, shared beers together, and much later I found out about what he did. Freddie was a rifleman, a squad leader, and was expert at his job. Valdez was a radio operator and photo observer because I knew how to read maps and call in rounds. I went to all 4 companies A, B, C, and D. I remember when I went from being a radio operator to being a forward observer. It was Christmas Eve, 1966. They shot my forward observer, so I took on that responsibility. What happened is we walked into an ambush. We went on to go and clear out an area and patrol it. We were not a full platoon out on patrol. That part was I just wanted to mention, another, person that knew Freddie, and as far as war and forward, not, like JJ Avila, Coach Bellah, they knew him before, before the war.
That's a very interesting thought about how maybe you're not considered a hero until the actual, the actual action of becoming the hero is prefaced by your death, right?
Yep.
Your sacrifice.
Yep.
That's man, that sounds kind of morbid to me, but I can only relate it to the way I know how, which is music legends. Like some of the greatest ones have died in their prime. Man, like I'm trying to think of the ones Keith Whitley for one.
Well, dude, didn't Greg Allman just passed away?
Greg Allman just passed away. He was only 69. Prince definitely still had many more years left. David Bowie had definitely more than a few. Merle Haggard seemed like he was never going to die.
Yeah.
And Guy Clark kind of the same. But, regardless, they were all kind of older. But there have been a lot of Kurt Cobain.
You're right. Yes, exactly. That's who I was going to say. Kurt Cobain.
Chris Cornell recently.
Yes, that one. That's a big one,
yeah.
I think, especially for now. Yeah.
man, it's just it's kind of sad, and I hate that I'm about to quote Def Leppard. Like this feels like the dumbest quote of Def Leppard ever. Like, but anyway, I forget the song, but what is it? It's one of the lines in one of their songs. It's better to burn out than fade away, or something like that.
There's actually well, I don't know. I don't want to say a few songs, but that definitely sounds familiar to me. But it's is it a Neil Young song or where it's like it's better to burn out than to rust.
Okay.
Or something like that. And I got that quote from Don because Don Henley quoted that whoever that songwriter he got it from. But it's similar to what you're saying. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Stevie Ray Vaughan died in his prime. Jimi Hendrix died in his prime.
Yeah.
And all those people are, I mean, legends, and they're heroes. They're mythical creatures because of their early passing. I don't know. It's an unfortunate reality almost. It's like, where does it come from? I don't even know if that's the right question to ask, but that's like the question that comes to mind. Like, where does it come from? Like, how does this happen where we build these people up in that way that when they die so young, they become these mythical creatures? Selena, another one that would be.
That's a great example.
Yeah, that would be
especially
local.
For South Texas. We'll say for South Texas.
Yeah, it's one that would be local.
Freddie Fender.
Freddie Fender, yeah.
Man.
Just, I guess, something to ponder about for now, but
no, yeah, we definitely.
Maybe we don't spend enough time appreciating what we have while we have it.
Now, and that's very stoic. It's like today, now.
Yeah.
Like, and we'll go off on that tangent maybe later. But I feel like we've touched those things a lot. Every time we always end up with some type of macro dealing with time and making sure you value your time and whatnot. But yeah, in our case, as far as music goes, like it's still near and dear to us because it's important to us. That's what me and Eddie are revolving our careers around. Regardless of what everybody else is doing or what everybody else thinks. Like this is part of our world. Like these military guys, the guys mentioned here in this book, Jocko, Leif, Tim Kennedy, David Burke, all these guys that are out there. Doing they chose. We're all choosing. We're all going. We're all moving. All right, back to the book. After he made the rank of sergeant, Freddie took on more responsibility and felt great about it. So did the men who followed him. The war was getting hotter, the enemy more resolved and tricky, mingling more with the South Vietnamese civilians and making it tough to know enemy from friend. Being a sergeant was special for Freddie because the Marines taught him what it meant from a historical perspective to help instill in him the proper level of pride and sense of importance in his new rank. He'd only been in the Marines for a little more than 2 years, and he'd already gone from private to private first class to lance corporal to sergeant, a rapid rise in the ranks. The military has defined a sergeant as a hard father, lone hero, best friend. Achieving the rank was a real milestone in a man's career. It was a clear sign that he could lead. He would be following in the footsteps of legendary U.S. military sergeants such as Alvin York from World War I, Audie Murphy from World War II, among many other great ones. Those are 2 wars. And since then, we've had Vietnam, the Korea, the Gulf, then we have Afghanistan, Iraq, like all those unnamed guys. And to tell in Memorial Day, that's why we have Memorial Day. All right, back to the book. A good sergeant has to be aggressive, self-confident, optimistic, the leader out in front in encountering the enemy. In Vietnam, many of them were 20 or 21 years old, making life and death decisions. And they had to deal with the death of their own men. Infantrymen know another old saying. Generals plan wars, sergeants win them. Freddie divided his time in the first several months of his second tour between several areas of Vietnam, spending what seemed like endless hours and days in the bush on patrol. So this is... he ended up being part of a Tet Offensive, and I wish I had more details because I know I've definitely read it in another book, the Tet Offensive. So it's interesting, like that tale. And so far, the name never came up in this book. I believe it was Colonel David Hackworth, who also served in Vietnam. He was also involved in the Tet Offensive, which was this big. What's the proper word? Conflict. It was one of the main conflicts at the time in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive started on January 21, 1968, when 40,000 North Vietnamese Army troops attacked 6,000 Marines in Khe Sanh. General Westmoreland, commander of all troops in Vietnam, ordered air battalions to try and pummel the enemy troops into submission. With 100,000 tons of bombs dropped over a period of several weeks, it averaged one airstrike every 5 minutes. About 10,000 enemy soldiers died, and about 500 American troops were killed. Even today, 4 decades after the horrendous destruction, vegetation is still slow to grow around the large area that was the Marine camp of Khe Sanh. White phosphorus from artillery rounds continued to smolder the intense summer heat. So biggest thing about numbers is 40,000 versus 6,000, then 10,000 enemy soldiers died. Some of those, and I think it's specifically a Tet Offensive because, like I said, it was mentioned in the Colonel David Hackworth book, where some of those were not accurate numbers, and I wonder like the depth of this guy's because, like I said, want to trust the rest of it, but when numbers are given, when data like that's given that I've already read of. This is what was officially reported versus what actually occurred, and some of like where, let's say sergeants and the guys who were on the ground really knew what was going on. The guys out in the helicopters that weren't the best leaders with their guys were giving like bogus numbers, dude. And half the time, and Jocko talks about this. Jocko talks about this. Colonel Hackworth talks about this, where a lot of times there wasn't even an enemy to shoot because of booby traps. There's booby traps. There's all these things that didn't involve an actual. So there was no one to shoot, and it mentions here in the story already briefly where you can tell civilians from the enemy, and it talks about that. You're fighting in rice paddies. People harvest rice paddies. There's people out there, and I know I think it was in that book. Steal My Soldiers' Hearts by Colonel David Hackworth, where he mentions that, or at least maybe one of the soldiers talks about where, like, the civilians had to have been helping them, because how could they not step in a booby trap, but yet every time Americans would come through with a platoon or a group of soldiers, they'd happen to be the only guys to step on a booby trap and then, die or get killed. Super crazy. Because those are big numbers, 10,000, 40,000 troops assumed. I'm gonna say assumed, and 10,000 enemy soldiers killed. It's like okay, it's just a big question mark because of other books, like I said, given. So then the book inputs little conversations of that were happening at the White House, and I'm not gonna read them all, but basically at the end, I will read the last one. At the end, Senator Lausch, I'll say that, Lausche. He was part of the Foreign Relations Committee, and I'm just going to read what he wrote, because I think you'll get it. Mr. President, as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I find myself in this dilemma. The Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate is engaged in intense activity to prove that we should have not engaged in firing in the Tonkin Bay, response to alleged enemy action against U.S. warships that initiated U.S. military action in Vietnam. In my opinion, those who are prosecuting this view, and I want to repeat vigorously that the United States government was completely in the wrong on the Tonkin Bay developments. Post facto, judgment is supposedly pertinent, and I want to warn Secretary McNamara that he is to be called and to be demonstrated to have misled the nation into improper use of military forces in Tonkin Bay. And for me, that's just like a whole can of worms that led to the rebelliousness of halfway through Vietnam to the end of Vietnam. Just where everybody was, once they found out about the Gulf of Tonkin, because I think that came out after the war started. Like, hey, wait a minute, Gulf of Tonkin, like what the heck was going on there? And I remember, it had to be, I want to say it was 8th grade history, where I think we went over Vietnam. And I remember the Gulf of Tonkin being mentioned, but it was only mentioned. We're like, oh, this is where the war started, blah, blah. Regardless of what our teacher knew or didn't know, reading this, it took me back to that, because that was my first introduction to Vietnam War, I would say. At least a good debriefing of what was going on. But the Gulf of Tonkin, I think that's a very big controversial point. So here, it's they're going on patrol. They're in. It says now. This is from the book. Now on the morning of the 4th This is February 4th. Its first objective was the Joan of Arc School and Church, only about 100 yards away. According to Smith, the building was square with an open compound in the middle, and we found by about 0700 that it was heavily occupied. Smith's Marines found themselves engaged in not only building to building, but room to room combat against a determined enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Gravel remembered that in the Covent building, in these little cloisters that the ladies live in, we went wall to wall. One Marine would place a plastic C4 charge against the wall and stand back, and then a fire team would rush through the resulting gaping hole. In the school building, Sergeant Gonzalez' 3rd Platoon secured one wing, but came under enemy rocket fire across from the courtyard. The Marine sergeant dashed to the window and fired about 10 LAAWs to silence the enemy. A B-40 rocket shattered the grilled pane and struck Gonzalez in the stomach, killing him instantly. The truth not included in the official report was that Freddie did not die right away. He lived for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, semi-conscious for most of that time. Lieutenant Smith credited Gonzalez for taking out key rocket positions before he was killed. Sergeant Gonzalez was later awarded the Medal of Honor for both his actions here and on January 31. On the morning Freddie was killed, Dolia didn't sleep well. I was in church February 4th, had gone to Mass, and had to leave the church to go outside. I kept coughing, like something was choking me. So I left to go outside because it was cool outside. This friend of mine took me to church. I got back and she pushed me and asked, "Why did you do that?" I said, "I don't know," not knowing that was the same time my son was dying, she said. I felt like something had happened to Freddie. I just knew something was wrong, and I had not received any letters from him for a while. I used to run to my mother's house in the afternoons to see if he'd send a letter. Soon, she started getting letters back that she'd mailed to him marked "Return to Sender." A few days after that strange feeling, a Marine sergeant in dress uniform with a local police officer came to the city cafe in Edinburg, where Dolia was working, to inform her of Freddie's death. I knew it the minute I saw them. It's strange because I had eaten lunch that day, and I never eat lunch. And I saw them coming, she said. I just knew. I knew that day at the church. In an interview many years later for National Public Radio, Lieutenant Smith would recall his impressions of Gonzalez, one of the only enlisted men respected enough to be asked in on the officers' poker games. I told Gunnery Sergeant Canley to go relieve Sergeant Gonzalez after he'd been wounded. He told me, "Lieutenant, I will go and follow Sergeant Gonzalez around if you order me to, but Sergeant Gonzalez is still in charge of the platoon," Smith said with a slight chuckle. So even with a wound, he's still the leader. Even after all these years, I remain in awe of Sergeant Gonzalez. In my mind, I've always thought of him as one of the big guys. He just seemed older than everybody else. But not long ago, I found an old photo of me and Gonzalez standing together, and I was very surprised to see that I was a lot bigger physically than he was. He wasn't that big, probably 5'10", 165 pounds. But he will always be one of the big guys to me. One of the 3rd Platoon's 2 Navy corpsmen was 25-year-old Jim Okonsky. He was a senior in college studying music theory and composition, then pre-dental. When the realization hit him that I knew I'd be drafted, so I tried to volunteer for the Air Force, he said with a laugh. That didn't pan out at first, and I didn't want the Army. But in the meantime, he was snatched up by the Navy, and in boot camp he received official notification that he'd been accepted by the Air Force. Just my luck, he said. The last thing Okansky wanted was to be in combat with the Marines. But in the Navy, he was found to have the aptitude for a corpsman, the battlefield paramedics attached to the Marine platoons. I was issued a .45 automatic, but the guys found an M1 carbine with a banana clip, and I carried that for protection. I was the first one to get with Freddie after he got hit. Even though it's been 38 years ago, that image is still on the forefront of my mind, Okansky said. At the time I found out he was hit and went to take care of him, a Marine said, "Corpsman up," and that meant for me to come up there. It was dark in the room like at night, and the shells exploding around us were like lightning strikes. I got there right away. He had been hit by an RPG and was in two pieces. His legs were in one part of the room, a little room, about 12 feet wide and 12 feet long, and his torso had been separated from his legs. The first thing I did was I propped him up in the corner and gave him morphine. His entrails were hanging from the ceiling. He'd been blown up at the midsection, but he was cognizant. He was nodding his head at me and mumbling something. He was saying something, but I couldn't understand. I knew him personally, and I know he was just acknowledging that I was there and recognizing the fact that he knew he was a goner. I knew he was a Catholic, and I am a Catholic. And I leaned over and whispered the Lord's Prayer in his ear. And I got to, "Give us our daily bread." And a shell exploded nearby, he said. I knew I had to get out of there. He was still alive. But when I got to the door, another one of our corpsmen met me at the door, and we went in to help out. For years I felt guilty about leaving him there and had to get counseling. But my logic was that if I had been killed, I wouldn't have been any good to anybody else. Finally, 30 years later, I could stop repressing that and got in touch with some of my old comrades. Dolia Gonzalez, when told about what really happened to her son during the writing of this book, said it took great courage for Okansky to even run into that room under those terrible conditions. "I think he is very brave," she said. "That was a terrible place to be." Shortly after treating Freddie, Okansky was wounded by an enemy grenade explosion in the University of Hugh. "I was trying to get shrapnel out of a wounded Marine and picked up shrapnel myself. 11 of us got hit. One of the guys looked at my boot and said, 'Hey doc, there's blood coming out of your shoe.' I was medevaced out with the rest, and they sent me to an army hospital in Yokohama, Japan. Then I was later sent stateside to the Naval Air Station Hospital in Corpus Christi. I was in the Navy from 1966 to 1970. When I got hit at Hugh, I was one of 15 out of 150 of the A-11 left, which is the First Marines, First Division, First Marines. First Battalion of the First Marines. The rest were killed or wounded," he said. "I have to say, I was scared shitless too. It's funny, those Marines looked at me as an old man, and I was 25. I was a friend, a priest, a corpsman, a father and mother. For example, sometimes the guys would ask me, because I had almost 4 years of college, to write love letters to propose to their girl, that type of thing," he said. February 4, 1968, Sergeant Gonzalez was the 5th Edinburg War casualty. All 5 were Mexican-American Marines. He received his first tour of duty March 1966, concluded the tour in January 1967, but volunteered for a second tour in June 1967. He was a member of Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Division. On January 31, just 4 days before her son's death, his mother, Dolia Gonzalez, received word that Freddie had been decorated with the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with gold for achievements in support of the armed forces in Vietnam in their struggle against communist insurgents. A sixth soldier, Nolan Simmons, was killed 2 days after Gonzalez. She was notified after her son's death on Monday, February 12, while at work. It was a busy lunch crowd. The next day, students at Edinburg High School paused for a moment of silence to honor Freddie. The flag at the high school flew at half-mast Tuesday and on the day of the funeral. By this time, Freddie's old Texas friend from the platoon in Hugh, Eliseo Hernandez, was back home in Corpus Christi. One morning, his mother came to his room and told him that there was a woman at the door named Dolia Gonzalez. She had driven up from Edinburg because she wanted to be sure what happened to her son, Hernandez said. "I will never forget that." According to the military press report, his body had been transferred to the 3rd Medical Battalion for transfer to the States. Gonzalez's cousin and former teammate at EHS, Army Private First Class Arturo Shorty Garza, will accompany the body to Edinburg. On February 22, 1968, Freddie's body arrived with Sergeant Jack Jenkins departing San Francisco on American Airlines Flight 38, February 22, 1968 at 11:20 a.m. Arrived Brownsville on Braniff Flight 297 at 9:58 p.m., according to a release from Commandant 8th Naval District. Dolia had Freddie's casket taken to her home to spend one last night before the funeral proceedings, and Sergeant Jenkins would stand guard beside the casket outside the home, and later at the funeral home. At the funeral mass Monday, February 26th, the Reverend Joseph Lyons, priest at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Edinburg, told Dolia, "Don't ask why you are so lonely now, Dolia. He died for what he believed. He died a hero. Perhaps his death at a later time would not have been like this. Today, he is a hero." Reverend Charles Morin, Freddie's childhood religion director, officiated the solemn mass. "I am honored to have the privilege to serve in this matter. Freddie was one of my boys." So, detaching from the book for a second, obviously the funeral continues. He was buried, or is buried, at Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery, which is on that side of the expressway. If you know, Shunier turns into Richardson. There's a what's it called? I can't even think of it right now. What's it called?
An underpass.
No. What's that? Cemetery. I couldn't think of cemetery. I'm just thinking about Hillcrest Memorial. Oh, cemetery. Duh, right. So, anyways, so that's where he was buried, and I do remember going back in the day, like when I was younger, when I, quote unquote, wasn't busy, and we'd go out there and put American flags on some of the, because there's actually a lot of soldiers out in that cemetery. I don't know if people know that or not, but there's plenty. Because I remember taking flag after flag after flag, and we would just place them next to the tombstone, or the headstone. Well, John continues. He finishes with this. Basically, that's the closing, where this last part that I read was a statement made by Major General M.C. Fonikins, 1st Marine Division commanding officer. Basically, that final letter home. He was the one who did that, and that's what I read. And that's what I read in addition to what the priest said, and also is a religion director, or Freddie's religion director. So then John goes into what I've already briefly mentioned. We're like the process it took him to get my aunt to get the interview, to put the story on paper. I'm not gonna find how long it took, but it took a while, because he said he would go to lunch every day. And finally, it just happened where they ran into each other, like actually, where I guess he sat in her section maybe involuntarily, and she happened to wait on him, and by this time he had already known his story. So, as opposed to saying, "Hey, I'm from the Monitor, can I have your story?" "Hi, Dol, how you doing?" Approaching as a human being, not with a goal in mind. Trying to have a conversation, which maybe in his case, he has an end goal, but it's to bring the story to life. Like you're saying, these details that he did portray in the story.
Right.
He's able to do that, and it took him a while. And this started the fall of 1994, and this book was released 2006. So it took that long. And actually, I think 1994 was when the ship officially got. I'm just gonna say indoctrinated. I don't know what the proper term is, but we had the ceremony. I remember going to that ceremony. I was 3 years old, 4 years old. And we were in Corpus, because they did it out of the naval base station in Corpus, so that my aunt, it was easier for my aunt, and that's it. Now it's neat. They fly my aunt, they fly her out to Norfolk, because that's where that ship is stationed specifically. It's not in the San Diego base. It's in the Norfolk, Virginia base. So I know at least once a year they have basically they have her out for 3-4 days where they they have mom on the ship. That's what they call it. They call her mom. So they have her on the ship, and they do that once early in the year, like around January, February. And now that I'm thinking about it, they probably do it to commemorate, early February. He passed away February 4th, so just to commemorate that.
That's amazing. That's awesome.
Let me read this. This does give some more, I want to say, data that will give everybody more context, and then we'll wrap this up with the points that you wanted to bring up, Eddie. All right, so back to the book. The years seemed to move slowly after Freddie's death. But finally, in 1973, after so many years, the war in Vietnam was officially declared ended. The Paris Peace Accord was signed by North Vietnam and the United States. According to official military figures, combat air casualty files of November 1993 and the Adjutant General's Center file of 1981 from the National Archives, the Vietnam War claimed the following lives in terms of troop numbers and respective coalition nations. The Vietnam War claimed the following lives in terms of troop numbers and respective coalition nations: 47,378 U.S. troops, 15,000 of those were Marines; 223,748 South Vietnamese; 4,407 South Koreans; 469 Australians; 351 people from Thailand; 55 people from New Zealand; and 1.1 million North Vietnamese were killed in this macro conflict of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War wounded 304,704 U.S. troops, 1.1 million South Vietnamese, 17,000 South Korean, 2,940 Australians, 1,358 wounded from Thailand, 212 from New Zealand, 600,000 North Vietnamese. In addition, the U.S. listed 2,338 troops as missing in action. 2 years later, after the end of the war, after much wrangling among some of Edinburgh's powerful people who lived on Country Club Drive, that byway was renamed Freddy Gonzalez Drive. At 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, October 26, 1975, Freddy's promise to his mother was fulfilled. The Freddy Gonzalez Elementary was dedicated at the exact place he'd promised his mother he would build a big house for her. The U.S. Marine Corps provided a band, a dedication plaque, and a replica Medal of Honor to put on display. Invitations were sent out to Texas Secretary of State Mark White, Senator Lloyd Benson, and Representative Kike de la Garza, among many local dignitaries. The school board also sent invitations out to all of Freddy's Marine Corps buddies and friends of South Texas. American Legion Post 408, named for Freddy, held a barbecue after the dedication ceremonies. Colonel Marcus Gravel, Freddy's battalion commander, was there to speak about his Marine Corps service, as witnessed by him. He was stationed at the Pentagon at the time as a public affairs officer with the Assistant Secretary of Defense. Colonel Gravel presented Dolia with 24 red roses, a gift from the men that were in Sergeant Gonzalez Alpha Company, 3rd Platoon. About 200 people attended, packed into the school's cafeteria. Though it was bad weather that day, it was standing room only, according to an article printed that evening by the Edinburg Daily Review. And that's the story of, as best as I could note.
As best as you could, I guess, pick out from the sections.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, that's so great that they built the school right where he said he was going to build his mother her house. And it's, again, like it's so crazy to me because Edinburg is such a, it's not a big town by any means necessary, but it definitely ranges. You know, it's got a good size on it. 77,000 population about.
Yeah.
Man, like we're not more than a couple miles from Freddy Gonzalez Elementary. I live right down the road from it.
I'll say you live
like,
right down
there. And that all happened right there. And I had no clue. I just knew that he was a hero, hometown hero. That's all.
Yep. And I after, like I said, I recommend everybody go get this book if you're curious enough. So there are details that right now we're already, almost 2 hours in. I mean, if I read the whole book, yeah, we'd be here for 3-4 hours. This is not that. But the point is Memorial Day. Yeah,
it's important to have that perspective because it's easy to get lost in the let's get together and barbecue. Let's celebrate a 3-day weekend. Let's try to sneak out early on Friday to get a 4-day weekend. It's easy to get caught up in that and forget what this is all about. And then we're able to remind ourselves what this is all about, but then we even then still have almost no context, and it really takes a perspective like this one to really nail it in. What I've kind of been holding back this whole time since you actually started reading the first letter, and then when you were reading the paragraph about how Freddie's mom was 16 and he was born and then she went right to work and all of that, I started thinking a lot about legacy, and because that's something I think about pretty often, and it's just like man, like 16 is a really young age to have a kid. And then not only that, but she was washing and drying, man. She was, both mom and dad.
Yep.
And she raised, Freddie herself. And then, to have him go through high school and then be the first,
Yep, to graduate high school. I mean, we're not even talking college for our current situation. Right now everybody's, wanting to graduate college. This is then, high school is a big deal. This is when high school is a big deal versus now. It's like you need to graduate high school. You're going to go to college.
And now it's kind of just expected.
Advanced. Yeah, just advanced. Yeah, just moved.
But like she's 16. Like what a young age to have a son, and maybe even slightly unprepared, possible. And just a lot of unknowns at that age. I could not imagine having a son or a daughter, a child, and at 16.
Nope.
I don't know what I would do.
Yeah, it's beyond measure because we're now 24, 25, 26. So it's like I said, it's just beyond measure for now. But yeah, if you try to, it's hard to even comprehend or even bring up a theory about how it feels to be 16 and having a child and making a conscious choice to then continue to work, drop out of high school, go work to provide for the family.
Yeah. And then think about maybe how much flack she got from maybe some members of the community. I mean, I don't know what at all the dynamic was back then about having a kid at 16 years old, but I mean, right now, if you have a kid and you're 16 years old, it's pretty damn frowned upon.
Yeah, and I would say back then when it was even a smaller town, I would venture to say even more so.
Even more so. It probably flew around quicker than we could ever imagine at the moment. But I mean, just imagine how much flack she might have gotten for being 16 and pregnant and having a kid, and then having to drop out of school to to raise that child. But then look at, like, it just goes back to, like, everything for a reason, Yeah. Like, look at what he went on to do. And, like, the lives he saved and the lives he impacted and the community he's impacted.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Like, that's the main thing that sticks with me out of everything. It's just, like, you never know who someone's going to grow up to be. And everybody has a purpose. I feel like we're all here with a purpose. And we've got to leave the earth fulfilling that purpose. And, I mean, that's just a great example of that, I think. And you just never know just what might arise out of the situation, It's just such a blessing to think about, The gift of life and the gift of, like, the meaning of life and our purpose. And even when you're reading the paragraph about from a young age when they went to the movies and he saw the John Wayne movie with Iwo Jima, and that struck a nerve with him. Like, I think about the movie American Sniper and how, like, the dad in one of the opening scenes was like, there's the sheep and then there's the sheepdog and then the wolf, and he makes those analogies and he goes, and we're not raising sheep and we're sure as hell not raising wolves.
Yeah, you almost get beat worse if you become a wolf.
Right.
Which is, I think that's great.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty good.
And so in that family they were raising Chris Kyle and his brother to be sheepdogs, protectors, and the same way that Jocko, as he talks about in his podcast, he talks about his childhood and he says about how he always felt that warrior call.
Yeah.
And not everyone feels that. I don't think not everyone feels that sheepdog call. I know for the most part, definitely it's like not my thing, but. But like it's
I
very.
got your back.
Thank you. It's very clear that Freddie had that calling from an early age.
Yep.
And then to see where it took him in life. First to graduate high school in his family, very big deal, and then a month shortly after, decides to take the bigger step, the one bigger than himself, and lay down the ultimate potential sacrifice, which he eventually did fulfill.
Yeah.
Just legacy is a big thing, and I know, like, my brother is graduating high school in exactly a week, or I guess a little under now, 6 days, but he's graduating from high school finally, and while he's graduating salutatorian, which is a big deal for our family. It's a big deal for my mom. I think for me, it's just kind of like, well, he's my brother's always been smart. I just kind of he's been at the number 2 spot for for as long as I can remember, since middle school. And so, they've always been, duking it out neck and neck, and I knew he was always up there. So it's kind of no shocker for me. But for Mom, and for Dad too, for my parents, they were the first to graduate high school in their families. My mom's parents are from Mexico, and they immigrated here. And then, well, dads are from here. I'm not sure how far back in the lineage we have to go for Dad's family to be from Mexico, but that's where the ancestry is from as well.
Yep.
But again, my mom and dad, first generation high school graduates. Their parents did not graduate high school. They worked. They were ranchers or farmers.
Both,
they worked in the field. And so and then Mom, Dad doesn't have a college degree, but Mom went on to get her college degree, but she had to work to supplement that financially, and she had to take a whole bunch of night classes in turn with that too. So it took her 8.5 to 9 years to graduate college, to finish and not owe a dime to anyone after all was said and done. And so she was getting teary-eyed the other night thinking about how now Justin is graduating salutatorian. My brother's graduating salutatorian. And so, I was kind of getting choked up hearing her talk about it because, and then I brought up again, legacy. You just, we come from not too far, not too many generations back, a couple of generations back where graduating high school was not a thing. And then now to have someone in the family graduating this far up in high school and then going on to college to, to hopefully greater and bigger things, it's just never know where things are going to turn up. But and I feel like something so grand and fulfilling comes out of something that starts out so small, like the humble beginnings of Freddie's mom. 16 years old, work in the field to support support her son, support the family, and then just look how many lives it's impacted since.
And hopefully now will only impact more with this little piece being revealed to the interwebs and you listeners out there.
And this is just one soldier who we are recognizing on Memorial Day. Yep. Think about that. Out of the thousands, if not millions, I'm not sure, but I couldn't give you an exact number.
Let me just that last bit that I wrote of the little the data. Second. 47,378 U.S. soldiers died, Vietnam. And then a little over 300,000 wounded. That's just one war. I'm gonna get a book from World War I. We'll do that another day. But trench warfare, World War I, that's ball game.
Yeah, that's I know for sure. I remember that from history class in college. That's definitely a game changer with World War I. But just for the listeners to think about, this is just one story.
Yeah.
And just hopefully it gives you some perspective from hearing Andy read this. Hopefully it gives you some perspective, just some insight into one soldier's impact on a community, on our hometown that is now 77,000 strong.
Yeah. Yes, precisely. Well, we can wrap it up there. Don't worry about social media today, Eddie. Just because I'm gonna close with this letter.
Okay.
It's gonna be in the show notes. I always leave in the show notes just for this one because I think, I honestly want to close this out.
Go for it.
This is Freddy Gonzalez's last letter to his mother. He died 11 days later during the Battle of Hugh City, defending his platoon at the St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church. January 24, 1968. Mother, I was shocked to hear that Victor got killed, but it's things that will happen in war. Mom, please don't worry about me, because I'll come out just fine. Remember what I told you before I left, that I would come right back. I hope all the people back home remember Victor, because he didn't give his life for nothing. It was in the line of duty. His life was given willingly rather than taken. That's the way I think. That's the way I want you to think. I wrote Victor's wife yesterday, telling her how I felt, and to let her know that if there's anything I can help out, I will be glad to do it. Well, Mom, regards to all the family. Write soon. Love your son, Fred. P.S. I have gone to Mass when I can. Sometimes the chaplain piles up empty boxes and makes an altar in the field. We have mass like that. Have been going to confession too.